Okay, I think that the attendance has at least slowed in pace. So I want to welcome everybody to this newest webinar here at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. We are thrilled to be joined by a wonderful panel of speakers to discuss European, German, and U.S. Regulation of the internet and strengthening democracy in the digital age. This is a sort of continuing effort on the part of the German embassy and particularly the German ambassador to sort of do field work here in the US to get a sense of work that's being done on tech. And so we were approached by the German embassy, and we're thrilled to work with them on this. We've got three excellent panelists to engage in this discussion. From the German embassy, we have Ricklef Beutin, who's the Deputy Chief of Mission of the German Embassy here in the US. We have joining us from Washington, Chris Riley from the R Street Institute. And then joining us from Amsterdam, making sure that we are all on different parts of the world here, is our own Marietje Schaake, who is International Policy Director for the Cyber Policy Center, also a fellow in the Human-Centered HAI program here at Human-Centered AI program here at Stanford. And I'm Nate Persily. I'm a law professor here at Stanford and also the co-director of the Cyber Policy Center. If you would like to ask our panelists any questions, please, and we encourage you to do so, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom. And we will have some time at the end where we will engage with audience questions. I'll be scanning them throughout in order to get a sense of what the questions might be from the audience. With that, let me start sort of with the first set of questions. We're going to do this mainly as a conversation, since I think all of us have been zoomed out at this point and giving speeches, and so but ask the panelists to take the time that they need. And we'll start with Ricklef with sort of the staging question, which is to talk a little bit about the problem, the challenges, the opportunities as you see them, and from the perch of really the German government in thinking about the internet and democracy, about the platforms and democracy. Obviously, this is an enormous topic that we can't even begin to wrap our arms around. But as the German government and you as a representative of them here in the US are thinking about this problem, what would you like those of us in Silicon Valley to hear? What would you like this American audience to hear?
Well, Nate, thank you very much. And let me start before I get to your question by extending a word of gratitude to Stanford and the Cyber Policy Center, to you personally, to Marietje, and of course to all the panelists. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having the embassy with you. The ambassador would have loved to do this, but our Minister of the Economy is in town, and travels to the United States on the political level are picking up again quicker than we thought they would. But this is a good sign, so I hope everybody understands that she couldn't make it today. Thank you for having me. I think this is a very timely conversation in many respects. First of all, I mean, digital affairs, cybersecurity in particular, but in many senses affect everybody's lives almost around the world. If you think back 15 years, who was actually using the internet, 1 in 6 maybe. Today it's more than 60% of the world population, and well-being depends on it, right? Then we look around us and we see the mounting challenges. I mean, many of them, cybercrime, security issues, disinformation, they're not new, but they seem to be exacerbated, and many actors around the world are using the tools at their hand, not in a good way. And we're seeing that, and of course, we have to ask ourselves, what do we do with this? And thirdly, I think the rules, because this is such an important realm, the rules that we make and think about in Europe, in the United States as two main economic bodies of the world are able to shape the future, but we have to shape the future, and we need to talk about it. And then fourthly, new administration in place in the United States, elections going on in Europe in many countries, or coming up at least. There's a lot to talk about in many aspects, but digital and tech policy is certainly among the top 5, if not the top 3. And you've gone in the United States through elections recently, we in Germany are heading towards our elections in September, and I'm just mentioning the elections now because what's going on in the digital world has been so important here and is going to be so important in Germany and maybe in other countries in Europe as well. And so I want to lay out just one brief thing that is new on the German side, and that is, I don't know, in the audience there will be a lot of people who know this, but there may be some who don't. A few years ago, we adopted a new law in Germany, the Net Enforcement Act, that actually requires internet platforms to scan their content and to take hate speech and criminal activity down. There's been a lot of discussion in Germany as well. How much is it right to do that? Does it impinge on freedom of speech too much? But we've introduced it, and it's actually working quite well. And it's interesting. It's going to be interesting for me to hear from your side of the Atlantic how you see that in progress and working, right? And just recently, and this is talking about a few weeks ago, we've sharpened our knives a bit more and our tools in the drawer by introducing new regulations, adding to that in the sense that starting next year, February, online platforms not only have to scan the content, but also report certain statements, certain crimes, if you will, or threats of crimes that are perpetrated online. They have to report that to federal police, including IP addresses and the like, so that prosecution is possible. That is probably something that is more intrusive than would be possible right now in the United States and in many other countries. But it's the result of observing what has been going on over the past years online, and a much more sober assessment of the great possibilities that the internet and digitization offers versus threats to the individual, but to democracy overall. And I'm happy to discuss the two philosophies a little bit. I certainly think that this is something that needs to be part of the transatlantic conversation, because I think our assessments in many senses are alike. Our tools in many senses are not right now. And so it's a very good conversation to have. I'll stop right here for the moment.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up, which is, sure, there's a big debate among the sort of social scientists in my world about assessing the success of NetzDG. And I was wondering, how do you, because you said that you feel that it's been successful, and I want to get a sense of why you think that. What is it? And for the audience, just to add a little bit more to this, right? It is requiring the platforms to take down illegal speech after a certain amount of time that when they've been told that it's on there. And there was certainly some criticism at the early stage that this would lead to have a chilling effect, that you would end up having platforms doing sort of over takedowns, that they would end up taking down speech that was not necessarily illegal, but that was borderline, and that it could have certain political and other kinds of impacts. And so I was just wondering what your sort of assessment is, why you think it's been successful, because that has been, I think it is fair to say, that of the democracies, the regulations that have come out of democracies, that is the one that is the most I'm going to use the word like professional, that it's the most serious attempt to go after some of this speech online that doesn't do something, for instance, like we've seen in India or in some other governments where it's been much more happenstance, episodic, or chilling. So I just want to get a sense of how do you assess success there?
Well, I think part of the success, and I mean, depending on who you talk to, I would get a lot of pushback, I'm sure, for what I'm saying now. But I think part of the success is that the discussion around it has died down a lot. There was a big discussion about this before we introduced it, and when this was in the making. Of course, there were a lot of conversations that the government had with companies and platforms about this. I mean, this got to be implementable as well, right? I mean, you can make all the rules you want, but if the capacities just don't allow for it, it's not going to do much. But I think since it's been in force, it's worked quite well. The platforms have adapted and created, the structures that they need to actually monitor this to a large degree. And it's not had the chilling, at least from what I can observe, the chilling effect that you mentioned on free speech overall in the German political realm. I cannot discern that as in reality, or as much as a lingering concern right now than vis-a-vis maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when this was I don't have a number at hand of how many cases there are actually every day or every week. It will be a large number of cases, but I think overall it's worked quite well. But I'm happy to take criticism and pushback from any of the panelists on this.
No, I think really it's really important, and this I'm just again saying more as a social scientist, for us to get a sense of the impact, because I think you're right, which is that a lot of the fears that people had at the front end have not been realized, and trying to figure out why that is I think important. What is the nature of the takedown? And what's being taken down and left up, I think deserves a lot of further study, as well as the question as to whether NetzDG had a retarding effect on the development of small new entrants, right? Because one of the, same with GDPR, that one of the concerns is that it's all well and good for Facebook and Google to apply to these kinds of laws, but what about the new up and comers? Marietje, let's go to you to sort of abstract out beyond Germany and talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe. And I think continuing in this theme of the sort of different way that Europeans are looking at the problem, and like I said, we're talking about many different problems at once here. But what I mean, you've now had a foot in both countries over the last few years. What has sort of struck you, both as to the trajectory that each country is taking, as well as sort of what we can sort of think about in the regulatory environment right now?
Thank you, and great to see you all on the screen. Let me pick up where the previous discussion that Ricklef led about NetzDG left, and then go to the broader question of EU versus US, because I think it is important to note how much has changed in the US, in Europe, in the world, in terms of perceptions of the benefits to society or the harms and risks for society coming from social media platforms, big gatekeepers and big companies. When Germany started with NetzDG, it was one of the first of such, far-reaching initiatives. And I think a lot of the criticism, which may now seem to have been overblown, was in a context of quite a lot of celebration in the United States about how successful and how beneficial the big tech platforms were, and in a moment where there was not as much appreciation for the harms and risks that I think in Europe were already seen. And now, unfortunately, after a lot of very unfortunate events like the storming of the US Capitol, like the spreading of conspiracy theories, like sowing doubt about the integrity of the elections, like lies about COVID and the vaccines, is a discussion that has also hit home in the United States. So now to the differences and also a lot of similarities between the EU and the US. I think one is particularly under this administration, but also looking at recent proposals coming out of Washington, we see an increasing meeting of minds between the EU and the US, where in the EU, there are now EU-wide legislative proposals to impose more responsibilities for gatekeeper companies, to increase competition, to spell out more clearly on an EU-wide level, so not just a German level, what is expected from online services when it comes to content moderation, how it should be done, what the parameters are. There are similar initiatives coming out of the Capitol that are looking to add to the sort of classical antitrust rules that are looking into the harms to society of social media platforms. And so I think it is a good sign that transatlantic partners are cooperating more than they were with the last administration. But also it is crucial now because one of the main challenges we both face is, of course, the rise of techno-authoritarianism, a completely different model where democracy is not even something to defend. And so what I hope is that this collaboration can continue. In Europe specifically, though, and this is something that I think has not been discussed as much in the various webinars and sessions around social media platforms and the harms to democracy, is that in Europe there has been a specific proposal made to protect democracy. It's called the Democracy Action Plan. And even though, on merits, we can talk a lot about whether it's far-reaching enough and, whether all the challenges within the EU are sufficiently addressed. And my answer to that would be no. But the idea and the very legitimate point to go directly for defending democracy in light of the polarization, the algorithmic amplification of hatred and doubt about the elections, I think is an important thing to keep in mind, as opposed to hoping that market interventions like antitrust enforcement or responsibilities for gatekeepers will have an externality as an effect that will then support democracy, which is something we often hear. We often hear hopes expressed that maybe with more antitrust enforcement, there will be a better outcome for democracy. In Europe, we see a tendency to say we need to go after the harms to democracy directly. And maybe this is something to also look for more transatlantic cooperation around.
Could you talk a little bit about that last point, though, particularly like if we think the problem from a democracy standpoint, leaving aside the structural features about big tech companies, particularly foreign big tech companies from the European perspective, having this much power. But if the problem is disinformation and polarization, right, from a democracy standpoint, what exactly can be done in the regulatory environment in Europe to get at those problems?
Well, there is a proposal to have a repository of political ads so that people can check and verify the messengers. There are links made to data protection to say we need to cut down on micro-targeting. There are proposals on advertising finance and also campaign finance, but also on the other hand, to have more investment in media. Mm-hmm. So it is not only aimed at, so to say, the disinformation coming from the platforms. It is also very much about how advertising is allowed to go around elections in general, and about the very important role, which is under huge pressure, both in Europe and the US, of local media, of independent journalism, and a pluralist media landscape. So it seeks to, come at the problem both by mitigating harms, but also fostering a more healthy public debate with multiple voices that is not necessarily tied to the tech advertisers.
And I do think that aspect of intervention, which you've seen in some, like the Swedish government has been extremely aggressive in this realm, also in using public media to essentially dilute the bad stuff on the internet by providing a lot of good stuff. When we make those kinds of recommendations here in the US, the idea that the National Public Radio or PBS would serve that purpose is caricatured, right? Because we just don't have the robust public media and the capacity that you have in Europe, let alone the trust, bipartisan trust in that kind of media, or multi-partisan trust that you have that kind of media in Europe, whereas PBS and NPR in the US are not trusted by both sides. In that vein, Chris, let me turn to you. You've heard this discussion about what's happening in Europe. Could you talk about what's happening in the U.S. in light of what both Ricklef and Marietje have talked about with respect to Europe? Meaning that, so this is the European approach that they've put out there. How would you describe what's happening in the U.S. And whether there is a kind of intersection of the Venn diagram here to what we're seeing in the U.S. and in Europe?
Thanks, Nate. I'd be happy to. Though first, I have to give a shout out to some of the work that's happening on digital public infrastructure, including at the Knight First Amendment Institute in New York. And while the concept of public infrastructure takes on a very different light in the United States than it does in other parts of the world, where government investment and engagement is a little bit more active. There is a very real movement here to try to look at other alternative approaches and models by which we could help to build some real pro-democracy structures and technologies that I'm very excited about. That said, it's hard for me not to be thinking in this conversation about how the US simply is not leading anymore in tech and internet policy issues. For a very long time it did, but that just hasn't been the case. And all too often Germany and the EU are. Whether you agree with NetzDG or the Nets Enforcement Bill that's been discussed or not, it was an innovation in how to approach the role of government in governance of platforms. And similarly, the German government has innovated in the intersections of data protection and competition in ways that are very meaningful in how technology is designed and made available to users. And that kind of innovation just hasn't been as present here. I have to plus one Marietje's optimism for the Democracy Action Plan and some of the ways in which Commissioner Jourova has frankly innovated in models of fundamental internet governance. And while I don't see any potential for a Democracy Action Plan like structure in the US, I do have some hope that some of these innovative ways of looking at what I like to think of as co-regulatory governance structures that really lean on platforms to engage and to come to the table, I have some hope that there's potential for mirrors of them in the American light here. The US is speeding up. It is looking more. I think the House is actually still in session over the marathon package of antitrust reform bills that the House Judiciary Committee has been reviewing after a session that ran until 5 a.m. East Coast time yesterday and then picked back up today. This is in parallel, of course, to the European Union looking at the Digital Markets Act, which has its own slate of very strong interventions. Here, the context for creating real policy solutions is extraordinarily challenging because there has been a massive degradation in public trust in both government and industry. It just makes it hard to have real conversations, I think. So many of the conversations that we have about regulatory direction in the United States are frankly political wars rather than serious efforts to arrive at policy solutions. Not all of them. There are a lot of good conversations happening, but it's very easy to lose the good, meaningful policy and reform conversations that are tackling real problems in all of the noise that can surround them from time to time here. And that's part of why I'm very fond of talking about what I call the critical community, the force of civil society institutions, researchers and advocates and others as a source of influence on the practices of technology companies in the private sector, apart from, but not independent from, the role of regulation and law in this country. I see a lot of really practical good things happening as a result of the kind of public pressure that groups like Sleeping Giants have been investing in and bringing about over the years here. Don't get me wrong, I see the need for regulation. I don't think regulation should be band-aids or paper over or ignoring problems. I just think that particularly in the American context, it's very important to approach regulation as, at least in part, if not in substantial part, as a tool for facilitating the effective use of things like the critical community and of market forces as tools for calibrating responsibility, creating incentives to build technology to be a positive force. I think we've all sort of learned in recent years that the idea that technology is neutral is a farce. Technology is not neutral. And so what I aspire to are how we can have conversations with government, but not just with government, about ways to set incentives to help technology be for good. And I see real potential for alignment with the US and with Germany and with the EU here, which is why I'm so excited to be having this conversation. I see industry starting to take responsibility for its role in this ecosystem and coming to the table more and more to talk about policy. But I admit the road ahead here is very, very long.
What's your best prediction about what's going to happen in the sort of U.S. regulatory environment in the next 2 years? Do you think? I say 2 years, just assuming this Congress, because who knows what's going to happen after that, which is basically a year and a half. But you're in D.C., right? So be our man in D.C. here. Tell us what we should expect. What's likely? I mean, antitrust is top of mind just because of last week. But what would you predict has the greatest chance in the kind of U.S. regulatory environment?
Yeah, I'm actually, for the record, in California, not too far from you in Marietje in East Bay. I work for a DC-based institution, but I'm lucky enough in the post-pandemic world of remote
Yeah,
work
I mean,
to be able to be
these
here.
days,
Could
as
be
far as
anywhere.
you're closer to DC than I am, so I'll
Fair
take
enough.
you're in DC. So.
Yeah, I mean, the old line, which I believe to be true, that if you ask three observers of the political landscape in DC what's going to happen, you'll get four answers, completely different. I mean, I do believe that to be true. I see an enormous amount of momentum for regulatory change. I see a very distinct possibility for the actual passage of law that regulates technology sector practices, whether that comes about in the sort of three big areas of privacy, competition, and content regulation, and in what order, I couldn't tell you. I certainly think there will be some of the many bills that have been introduced and discussed in the House. I think at the very least, some of the lighter lift of those will make it into law. That doesn't sate the need for major shifts in the levers of power that I perceive as being felt in Washington right now. Whether you agree with that need or not, I very much perceive a need to shift the levers of power.
I'm not sure I understand that last point.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that? So that the platforms will still have too much power, or that what are the levers of power you mean?
I wrote a piece several years ago, riffing on Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, or Utopia, to describe the mechanics of internet governance in practice as sort of a complex system of emergent forces, and it reflects the actions of users, market forces, individual company practices, and technology design decisions, and laws and regulations. So when I think of the levers of power, I think of how those can be pushed or pulled by different forces, how things like transparency laws give ammunition to researchers and to advocates to bring about more public pressure, how market interventions don't just have a direct impact on the practices of companies, but change the ways in which other companies can press against each other. So that's my context for that sort of dramatic levers of power language. I apologize, but I think that there's sufficient consensus that the ways in which power has been established in internet governance is not satisfactory, that some major intervention will emerge. I couldn't tell you which one it will be, whether it will be one of the stronger bills being discussed in antitrust, or whether it will be something that makes changes to Section 230, which is the safe harbor. Sorry, it's an immunity provision, not a safe harbor that must be earned, but rather a powerful immunity provision in American law that many have cited as being a very powerful force in the creation of the internet, just as others cited as the biggest obstacle to pursuing real reform of some active online harm that we see today.
Well, and that's an important stepping stone to the next set of questions, but I want to just hone in on the question of whether the Democrats and Republicans, they both are united in their hatred of big tech right now, but not much else. And so, but perhaps that because antitrust and competition policy is in some ways a blunt cudgel to get at the companies that they don't like, that seems to me to be the one where you actually have a convergence of interest, whereas on the content moderation side, they pretty much are diametrically opposed as to what the goal is here, whether it's to take down more content or to prevent the takedown of more content. Is that fair?
I wouldn't go quite that far on the Section 230 side. I think that there are pieces of the possibilities of reform in this landscape that are not simply about the most common talking points of whether to take down more content or put it up. Pieces around transparency, pieces around compliance with government order standards. And the two threads to that conversation to me, sorry if this is too much of a deep dive, but we have to figure out how to calibrate what level of responsibility we expect from companies and the procedures that they build in here. I think that thread is shared by both sides of the party. How they implement them is obviously different, but there is a shared understanding of the need to recalibrate the responsibility and the expectations we have. That said, I think most people would agree with you that there's more likely to emerge an alignment of the sides in the competition landscape than content. But never, it's a magic 8-ball, I think, at this point for me, and I wouldn't rule out any possibilities.
Great. Let's turn to, we've talked about government regulation, and I want to continue on that theme, but I want to start talking a little bit about the problems, and in particular, what we think the companies should be doing. And so from a kind of European versus US perspective here. And so Ricklef, let me go back to you, if I could. And so to give us the German perspective on what, what should Facebook, Google, YouTube, and Twitter be doing that they're not doing now? Is there a view, leaving aside the hammer of law enforcement here? What is it that, if the internet and social media are posing threats to democracy, what are concrete steps that you think the companies should be taking? And, I am actually here in Silicon Valley, so, we'll send this message outside my window here. What would you like to see these companies doing that they're not doing now?
Well, actually, I'm not the one to call for one or the other thing, but I do think that, at least that's my observation, that the thinking has changed quite a bit in these companies as well over time, right? I mean, they've been around for a while, not very long. I mean, 15 years or so is not very long, but we've come very far in the whole regulatory environment, but also in the power of these platforms. And they realize that they are much more than a neutral technology, as Chris said. They realize that what they offer and have to offer in terms of possibilities goes with a lot of possibility for bad actors as well, and therefore a degree of responsibility. I think they've mostly accepted that, but it's hard to balance the different goals and the different policies and philosophies. And I also would give them credit for having to manage different regulatory environments, European versus US for that matter, for example, but also the German one being particularly challenging for them now because of the laws that we talked about, and because of historically induced difference in constitutional setup and also attitude of the public and what is allowed and possible in terms of free speech. Now, I think it's been pretty hard discussions with them in Germany over what they can actually do and on implementation of NetzDG. And I'm sure the discussion over the implementation of the new regulations, where they have to actually inform federal police of serious crimes that are committed or threatened online, is ongoing as well. But I think they're shouldering this responsibility, and that's great, and that's what we expect, right? I mean, the law of the land in Germany is different now than it was 5 years ago, and that's the way it is. You're closer to the headquarters of some of them, so if you can lay out what your impression is, actually what they would say, as you hinted at in the beginning, that would actually be helpful, because with the conversations that I'm having in webinars like this or privately, they usually they see this responsibility, and they'd rather have governments regulate more, so they have a certain setup that they can deal with, rather than everybody throwing only the responsibility at them and saying, yeah, the content is on your platform, so you deal with it. And that, I think, is a very interesting development that we've seen over the past years. But the details actually, is with every different regulation and every different problem, and it's different with the fields that you laid out, be it content, be it data protection, be it antitrust. It's not all the same. But if you can help me along a little bit, I'd appreciate that as well.
Well, I'll do that, and I think Marietje, has some more to say on this. So I want to let her jump in on that too. But just again, for the Americans who are on the call on the Zoom, to get a sense of the German perspective of the problem that you're seeing in the tech sector. So, for example, in the U.S., Facebook right now, in the public opinion, there's very low public opinion of Facebook. Less so for some of the other internet companies, but then as well. And so there's, I think, emerging, view among, the tech sector, which was seen as, riding high 5 years ago, is now in public opinion seen as contributing to, find your pathology. Coronavirus disinformation, right? Election manipulation, foreign interference with our elections, let alone the kind of privacy issues. And I look, there's always a challenge in having this kind of discussions that we're, talking about everything at once. But I want to get it sort of think particularly about how the different cultures and countries are thinking about this. And so, just to give a sense of the particular problems that you see Germans as viewing, Facebook and Google and Twitter as causing in your society, what that would be the first step. So I've given you a litany about a lot of which is growing out of our elections and the feeling that the tech companies, right, are responsible for a lot of the disinformation and polarization and manipulation. That, I don't know, would you say it's very similar in Germany, that's the suite, or is it more on the, the privacy violations versus the, just having an American company coming in and dominating the German information economy?
Overall, I would say it was different from the outset, in the sense that there was more skepticism in Europe and in Germany in particular vis-a-vis the tech giants maybe than in the United States, for a number of different reasons. You mentioned some of them. Yes, the trust has probably decreased, or the expectation been heightened through, the things that you mentioned, disinformation and the things we've seen with your election, but also with COVID, disinformation, all that. I think so. The expectation is pretty high, and that goes for the German government as well. And I talked about that a few minutes ago. On the other hand, we have the same kind of phenomenon that you have here, that trust in government institutions and trust in public broadcasting, for example, that we have, and you mentioned regarding Scandinavia, but we have this in Germany as well, is decreasing as well. Many people, and I would say the large majority, take this as a main source of well-founded journalism and neutral information. But I do see, and I think this is worrying, the trust is decreasing. And many people get their news and their information from social networks, and exclusively from them, right? And that poses its challenges and dangers that we've seen here and we've seen in Germany as well. So we may be on different levels of intensity of the issue and the problem, but we see the same kind of phenomenon, and that's one reason why I think this transatlantic dialogue is so important.
And there are several questions in chat and thinking about what, say, Germany and the U.S. can do together on this. And I want to go in, for that matter, EU and the U.S. I want to go to that. But Marietje, maybe the same question to you, which is to sort of think about, from the European perspective, what should the companies be doing that they're not doing already?
Well, where to begin? I mean, I'm really much more skeptical and disillusioned, really. Maybe that's the best word for it. I mean, for those of you who may not have that context, I served in the European Parliament for 10 years, and I was known as somebody who embraced the opportunities of technology, who, was curious about technology, excited about technology. And of course, I was not naive about risks. We lived through the Arab uprising, saw how technology could be used, to help people, but also to repress them and so on. So the idea that policy would play a role was quite obvious for me, to make sure that democracy would be protected, human rights would be protected, and so on. And this has been a long-standing conversation I've had with different representatives of different tech companies. And I would really see huge improvement if they could be more honest and open. There have been so many lies that it's really hard to actually engage seriously anymore. And to put it in a slightly broader context, I think transparency for independent research, as you know, researchers that should be able to look at data to understand much better cause and effect, how data flows, what the uptake of certain messages is and why, how algorithmic amplification works. So many questions about the business models and their impact on the public good, on society, on minorities, on polarization, that really need to be looked into and scrutinized. And the same can be said for having more eyes looking at the problems would begin by the companies taking seriously that there are problems. I mean, we're sitting here with a focus on the transatlantic relation. We've acknowledged that in Europe, the concerns were more present for a long time, about, for example, the fueling of neo-Nazist ideas online, how people could be lured into ever more radical directions. But let's expand our view a little bit. Why do we still read reports that in Myanmar, again, Facebook has facilitated hate speech and calls for violence, even if mistakes were made, many, many times, even if better engagement was promised. So we've come to a point where we honestly have to ask ourselves, is Facebook and our other companies capable of following through what they're promising? And if they're not, then that's a big problem, because maybe, the monster of their own business model is too big to tame. But if they are capable and unwilling, we have another problem. So I think there's a lot that they can do. We hear, as Ambassador Beutin said, we hear representatives of the big companies saying, "Oh, we welcome regulation," but read the New York Times today about the responses to the legislative package that apparently is still under debate as we speak, as Chris reminded us. And what is it? To throw more lobbying money at it, to send out messages that this is the wrong direction, that it's going to stifle innovation, that America is losing its way. So we also need to look at what the companies do and not just at what they say. And there is a huge gap between those two. And I think it is also time that those companies own up to their mistakes much more, start investing more, and actually explicitly start committing to democracy. We've heard a lot of nice promises about the freedom of expression and so on, but there's also a bunch of companies that are happy to do business in whichever country they can, even if it means censoring critical opinions, even if it means filtering out different content. So a lot of the words that we hear are not very genuine, and I would hope that there could be more proactive acknowledgement of their own responsibility and their own commitment to democracy in deeds and not just in words.
Nate, would you mind if I just jump right in there and build on that a little bit? Because I'd love to. I think one of the places, and these are indeed very, very hard problems, and one of the reasons why I talk about and work in the sort of broadly construed space of multi-stakeholder internet governance as much as I do, is that I believe that the best answers, the best outcomes, the most trust, and the most sort of sustainable responses to these problems come in those areas where, for whatever confluence of reasons, we've created more of an open and trusting environment between industry and government and civil society actors. And I tend to look to cybersecurity, and this may be weird, there are lots of problems in cybersecurity, right? But as a space, we've come to collectively expect that perfection in cybersecurity is impossible. And the US government did this fantastic process through NIST over many years of convening a large multi-stakeholder conversation to develop something which was innovative and not perfectly executed and not as impactful as maybe it could have been, but I think a huge value add to advancing cybersecurity through the NIST cybersecurity framework. And I love seeing structures designed to encourage open collaboration. And it's been really hard to do on all of these other areas. It may be impossible in competition, but I do think there's more that we can do in content and online harms. I think we've made some real progress. I saw, just skimming briefly through the Q&A, one question about the sort of ABC's framework for researching disinformation, targeted disinformation campaigns. I think we're making real progress on targeted disinformation campaigns. I think that one, in some ways, while it's a hard problem, the incentives to collaborate and to be open and share information are much more naturally aligned there. And so we've been able to have really good, productive conversations, even in the absence of any sort of change to the laws and regulations involved underlying it. And I'm not saying that we can create that anywhere or recreate that, but it's a reason why I really do believe in things like when now Secretary Raimondo was being confirmed, she spoke about the value add of having a US government-led multi-stakeholder process where we really bring different perspectives together, because I think that we all have myopia. We all have big myopia as we approach these problems, and we need those sources of information and these really rich conversations to arrive at a lasting solution.
There are, I want to actually turn to some of those questions on German-US cooperation in this area. And so Ricklef, if you could talk a little bit about sort of, I don't know, ambassadorial priorities here. Thinking about what we, in the tech space, if you had to isolate the kind of cooperation that you could see between the US and Germany in particular areas, what would you point to as sort of the where you're spending your time, what looks most promising, given the change in administration, and I think a more open, turn to Europe. What are those areas? And you've talked a little bit about it thus far, but speak for the embassy a little bit here as to what you would think in as several of these questioners are asking the future holds. And is it possible? One of the things the questioners are asking is, given the different constitutional obstacles on some of these speech issues, is that really a non-starter? Because the idea, for example, of regulating, government regulation of disinformation or even hate speech in the U.S. is pretty much a non-starter under our Constitution, with some exceptions. But maybe leave that aside. What would, thinking about your diplomatic priorities with the U.S. and sort of German-U.S. cooperation, what would you point to?
Thank you, Nate. I want to talk about two different levels here. One is the bilateral track, Germany, United States, and then, of course, EU. And the US, and that is something that we carry forward also in our conversations that we as German embassy is having with the United States government. First of all, it's still early times with the new administration in many ways, because traveling and personal meetings weren't really possible until very recently. The administration is conducting a host of reviews of their policies that has not led to has not come to an end on many subjects. So we're still starting conversations. I think there is a number of different tracks. One is the EU track. Just last week at the EU-US summit that we were very happy about, the president coming to Europe and coming to Brussels and meeting first to Britain for the G7, but then to NATO and to the EU, and talking about all the issues that move the US government and that moves us. One of the outcomes, of course, is the high-level Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council that we had been pushing as Europeans, but also as Germans, and that this was agreed upon at the summit level is a big outcome. It will have a lot of follow-up on different fields, and that is going to be led by the EU institutions, first of all, and not by an individual member state, but we'll follow that closely. And that is going to be about, and Marietje, please jump in and put in the details more than I may be able to. But this is going to pan out in a lot of different regulatory fields. Secondly, I think the things that we talked about and that I talked about in the beginning, where we've expanded our laws and sharpened our tools, is more about law enforcement on crime, right? And that is a bilateral track that has been going on, that was going on pretty well with the last administration as well. But we, of course, with the new administration, want to intensify it. Regarding, for example, just for one example, terrorist organizations, white supremacy networks that in the United States domestically, in Germany domestically, but also more and more coordinate cross-border. That's something that authorities need to talk about, and that needs monitoring, and that's ongoing. And no, I don't think that the different backgrounds or cultures in terms of free speech make this a non-starter. Yes, we have things that cannot be said or that are illegal to say and post and show in Germany that wouldn't be illegal in the United States. But that doesn't prevent us from talking about, violence being coordinated, anti-Semitism being, profusely used, and that kind of thing. I think challenging topics will be competition, and because companies, European companies and American companies are competitors too, and so the competitive environment and the economic environment will not only be about how can we do things together, but that was the case in the past as well, and this is the case in different areas of the economy. So I don't think that's a problem per se either. If you want to know what is our priority here as embassy, I think we'll be talking to and we've already started that, talking to the US administration quite a bit about cybersecurity. We have a new envoy for cybersecurity issues in our Foreign Office. I've facilitated some talks for her virtually, first of all, because she hasn't been able to come with the US government, but also with companies and think tanks here. And leading up to the elections that I mentioned in the beginning, this is such a pertinent issue. And I mean, not only elections, you've seen the ransomware attacks. We've been able to get ransomware speech in the G7 communique and some follow-up on that, how we want to coordinate closer on that. So cybersecurity, first of all, is, I think, the highest priority right now. But that doesn't mean that we're leaving anything of the other fields behind.
Great. I do want to end with a little discussion on cybersecurity. Maybe Chris, I'll turn to you for that. But Marietje, I want you to chime in here a little bit. You're a member of like 6 of these transatlantic working groups at this point, I think. Can you talk a little bit about what this coordination looks like? I mean, if you had to benchmark it, what these next few years, or even what you're working on now, in any of these groups, what does it look like in terms of European cooperation and convergence with the US on any of these topics that we've been talking about?
Well, there's a lot of words about working together to strengthen democracy. And so that would mean that the EU and the US would be sort of a motor block to engage more democratic countries around the world, which is actually necessary to create a larger space where similar rules apply, and also to have weight vis-a-vis countries like China that have a very different and competing model. The ambassador just said that the EU and the US compete, which is true, but there's more that binds than that competes on that front, which is also good to note. But it's also in much more practical ways. I mean, joint investments in research, for example, research and innovation, coordinating things like safeguarding supply chains, or the availability of certain technologies like semiconductors. There's a lot of work foreseen when it comes to coordinating and streamlining AI regulations. And there's a sort of agenda that is still on the table, questions around agreement with regard to privacy and data protection, hopefully more coordination there. There is a whole agenda around data flows and digital trade rules that I think it will be extremely important not to overlook, because trade agreements are typically ways in which benchmarks, rules of the road can be enforced, and where you can also look at what an enabling environment looks like, which would include parameters of data protection, where I have to note it's still quite a vacuum that the US doesn't have a federal data protection law. So if I can express a hope, it is that the need to operate in this global context may actually lead America to appreciate that having some kind of model makes it easier to also defend and engage others around that model, instead of saying, well, our model is to have no model, but you are not allowed to do A, B, and C. It's just hard to negotiate on the basis of a vacuum, to put it short. So no absence of topics, a lot of work to do, a lot of compromise to be found. And I think that has been a spirit that's been missing a bit, because there has been such adversarial dynamics under the previous administration that on the one hand, there's a relief. It was tangible in Europe last week when Biden and all his officials came. But it's a relief, I think, mostly on the fact that there can be constructive engagement, and should not be mistaken for, a broad agreement on everything. And, all the differences are now brushed off the table. There will still be differences that have to be overcome, but at least the environment within which those conversations take place has just gotten a lot brighter.
Great, and I want to amplify one thing that you said on transparency, because this is, at least for me personally, one of the things that I've been involved in Europe as well as the US, which is, again, my self-serving effort to try to get researchers access to platform data. And I do think that this is one of these areas, because there is action that is happening in the EU on this. And my hope is that maybe, if we have a comprehensive data protection bill in the US, that there will be some serious attempts to include transparency and access to data. I want to end in talking about cybersecurity, if we could, and we've already gestured in that direction. But Chris, could you give us a sense of what the landscape? I mean, we've just lived through these large ransomware attacks. and it's presaging, a lot more to come. These were just the most sort of notorious ones. And I'd like to get, Ricklef, also your view on sort of how is Germany doing something different in cybersecurity that the U.S. should be following, or vice versa. Chris, do you want to just talk a little bit about what the what the cybersecurity efforts look like from the U.S. side?
This isn't a field I work in day to day, actually, so I'm not sure that I am well positioned to speak to this, other than to sort of reinforce my high level points, which I think are very true here, that the problems are very significant, and that we I think are well positioned to have concrete and collaborative discussions about how best to move forward. And I know that there are a lot of sort of big ideas on the table relating to, among other things, the role of cryptocurrency in facilitating these kinds of problems. But I don't have a vision, nor do I feel I can adequately represent the different visions that are competing within the political landscape in the space right now. But yes, certainly it is very challenging.
Ricklef, I'm sure from the diplomatic side that this is something that you're seeing quite a bit. And so is there something we in the US, because you mentioned this earlier, is there something in the US that we can learn from German efforts in cybersecurity? Is there some opportunity here for cross collaboration like we were discussing before?
I am absolutely positive on the latter of the two. On the first one, I'm not so sure, but I want to say that, and I know this more from my previous functions that I had in Berlin when I was much closer to these issues, that having been and constantly being a victim of attacks also on the government side, political parties have been attacked by hacks. The German Bundestag was hacked in 2015, and having seen a number of these, some have became public, others haven't. We have beefed up our capacities, the structures that the government has itself for monitoring and observing. We've beefed up capacities that we have on the military side, but they would probably not be as potent as the United States capacities. But having said that, cooperation in these cases, because they can hit anywhere, and quick information back and forth between the companies that may be involved, because there may be gaps in the structure, and we've seen that with SolarWinds in other cases, or critical infrastructure being targeted. To have the structures in place that quickly, very, very quickly inform each other of where the threat is and how you may be able to tackle it. That is, I think, day-to-day work that's been ongoing, but I'm sure can be improved, and that needs to include, public and private actors to be really effective. They will, like Chris said, it's never going to be 100%. It's always running and chasing after the best tool, but we have to be, on the edge here and try to do that. And this is a essential component of transatlantic cooperation.
I think, Marietje, if I could give you the last word, maybe you could talk a little bit about the Cyber Peace Institute that you are chair of, because that, I think, intersects here, because for people who aren't aware of it, and then just real quickly, and then we'll conclude.
Yeah, thanks, because it actually ties a number of the topics that we've addressed today together in this one mission, which is accountability. One of the big problems with the escalations of cyber attacks is not only that private companies have basically become the gatekeepers of national security. They are also the ones who observe threats first, sometimes before governments. I mean, the SolarWinds hack came to light because of another cybersecurity firm. And so governments are often blindsided and quite dependent on the private sector, while there are all kinds of actors, militias, people for commercial gains, like criminals, states that are abusing a legal vacuum and exploiting the fact that there are often too little or no consequences to perpetrators. So one topic that I think international cooperation, transatlantic cooperation could really focus on is accountability. and a better interpretation of international law or upgrading of international law where necessary to end the impunity in the space of cyber attacks.
Well, great. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience for your active participation in the chat. Stay tuned for more from the Cyber Policy Center in the coming months. I will say that in September, we will be doing our weekly cyber seminars live at Stanford from noon to 1:15, and hope to see many of you there. Thanks to all the panelists for joining us. And next time, let's do this live in Berlin. So wonderful to see everybody.
Here, here.
Thank you. And if I'm ever in San Francisco, I'll look you up on one of those.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.